Number 1. Warren Jeffs. It begins in the desert. Red cliffs, wide skies, and a community that seemed frozen in another time. Families lived in compounds, women wore pastel dresses that brushed the ground, and children marched in tight lines to schools run by their church. Outsiders saw only glimpses of this world. Warren Jeffs. To thousands of followers, he was the prophet of God. To prosecutors, he was a man who would spend the rest of his life in prison. Warren Jeffs was born into power. His father, Rulon Jeffs, led the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or FLDS, a breakaway sect that clung to polygamy after mainstream Mormonism rejected it. Warren grew up as one of dozens of children. He watched his father rule over members with total authority, teaching them that obedience was the path to heaven. When Rulon died in 2002, Warren was the natural successor. Tall, thin, and soft-spoken, he presented himself as a calm spiritual guide. In reality, he demanded absolute control over every part of life in the community. At first, the outside world saw only his public side. He preached sermons about purity and family, keeping his followers isolated from mainstream society. But behind closed doors, Jeffs arranged marriages that raised serious concerns. Families who questioned him were cast out of the church. Some parents lost their homes, their land, even their children, because refusing the prophet meant eternal damnation. He reinforced this with constant reminders. His word was God's word, and to disobey him was to disobey heaven. For years, little leaked out. The FLDS towns in Utah and Arizona were sealed off. Members didn't talk to reporters. Police officers were often followers themselves. But investigators began to notice troubling patterns. Birth records that didn't match ages. Families suddenly leaving with nothing. By 2005, the allegations were impossible to ignore. The state of Utah indicted Jeffs. Arizona prepared its own case, and the FBI added his name to the 10 most wanted list. For months, Jeffs was on the run. His picture, pale face, thin lips, dark eyes, appeared on television screens nationwide. He moved between safe houses, carried disguises, and relied on loyal sect members to shield him. The FBI believed he had access to millions of dollars in hidden cash. But his freedom ended in August 2006 when a Nevada trooper stopped a Cadillac Escalade near Las Vegas. Inside was Warren Jeffs, carrying multiple cell phones, prepaid credit cards, and more than $50,000 in cash. After a year of evasion, the prophet was in handcuffs. His first trial was in Utah. Prosecutors played audio tapes of Jeffs giving instructions to his followers. The jury heard how he ordered marriages that were outside the law. His defense claimed religious persecution, but the evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted as an accomplice and sentenced to prison. Later, the conviction was overturned on a technicality. For a brief moment, Jeffs thought he might escape justice. Texas prosecutors had other plans. In 2008, authorities raided the FLDS yearning for Zion Ranch in El Dorado, Texas. What they found shocked the country. Inside the sprawling compound were children assigned to unions with older men. In a temple, police discovered Jeffs' diaries and recordings that left no doubt about his involvement. In 2011, Jeffs was tried in Texas on charges of arranging illegal relationships. The trial lasted just 3 weeks. Prosecutors laid out every detail, showing how Jeffs manipulated his position as a prophet to enforce his will. The defense argued that he was a spiritual leader, not a criminal. But jurors listened to his own voice on the recordings. They read his journals. On August 9, 2011, the verdict was read, guilty on both counts. The judge handed down a sentence of life in prison plus 20 years. Even behind bars, Jeffs tried to maintain his influence. He issued letters from prison, warning his followers that the world would end if they abandoned him. Some members continued to send him money, hoping for his approval. But for the wider public, the image of Warren Jeffs had changed permanently. He was no longer the mysterious prophet of the desert. He was a criminal who had used faith as a weapon. The fallout spread far beyond his prison cell. Documentaries aired on CNN, National Geographic, and Netflix. Former members began to share their stories of exile and control. Families who had been torn apart slowly reconnected. States tightened laws to monitor religious compounds and protect children. And for many Americans, the case was a reminder that absolute power in the hands of one man without oversight can lead to devastating consequences. Picture yourself as a juror in that courtroom, listening to the tapes, watching the faces of the people who testified, feeling the weight of deciding whether a man who claimed to speak for God was guilty. That verdict carried not only legal force, but also moral clarity. Today, Warren Jeffs sits in a Texas prison. His followers still number in the thousands, but his power has crumbled. The temples in the desert still stand, but the world now sees them differently. What once looked like devotion now looks like a warning. The story of Warren Jeffs is not only about one man. It is about how faith can be twisted, how trust can be broken, and how justice can finally reach even those who call themselves prophets. Number 2. Keith Raniere. It began with a promise of clarity, empowerment, and success. In the late 1990s, a man named Keith Raniere introduced himself to the world as a teacher of human potential. He spoke softly, dressed casually, and claimed to have discovered techniques that could unlock the highest levels of personal growth. He called his program NXIVM, spelled with 4 capital letters, and marketed it as part seminar, part self-improvement path. At first, it looked like another motivational brand in an era full of them. Behind the curtain, it became something very different. Keith Raniere was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1960. He grew up with an interest in science and philosophy, and as a young man, he drifted into multi-level marketing schemes. By the 1990s, he was already the subject of lawsuits for false advertising, but that did not stop him. He rebranded himself as a thinker, calling himself Vanguard, a title his followers would repeat with reverence. With NXIVM, he built an organization that seemed, at least from the outside, to mix business training, therapy, and philosophy. Celebrities, wealthy entrepreneurs, and everyday professionals signed up for workshops in Albany, New York, paying thousands of dollars for the chance to break through their personal barriers. The setup was polished. Members wore sashes that indicated rank. Classes had elaborate rituals meant to give a sense of discipline and purpose. Students spoke about confronting fears and finding meaning. Some early participants described genuine feelings of motivation. But underneath, Raniere was building something far more controlling. He created an inner circle, convincing loyal followers to recruit others, sign non-disclosure agreements, and treat him as the source of truth. What looked like empowerment slowly revealed itself as obedience. By the mid-2000s, complaints began to surface. Families of NXIVM members said their relatives had become distant and secretive. Some said they were pressured to cut off loved ones who questioned the group. Reports described financial exploitation, with members drained of savings in exchange for higher-level courses. Investigators began to ask whether this was more than just a self-help business. And then, in 2017, the most serious allegations became public. Former members came forward and described a secret subgroup within NXIVM known as DOS. According to testimony, DOS was presented as a sisterhood of women dedicated to discipline and loyalty. In reality, prosecutors said it was designed to give Raniere control. Women were required to provide damaging personal secrets as collateral. They were pressured into acts they did not freely choose, believing refusal would bring exposure or punishment. It was here that the full picture of NXIVM shifted from self-help program to criminal enterprise. The investigation moved quickly. In March 2018, Raniere was arrested in Mexico and flown back to New York. He was charged with racketeering, forced labor, and exploitation crimes. His inner circle began to break apart. High-ranking members, including television actress Allison Mack, pleaded guilty to their roles and agreed to cooperate. The trial against Raniere opened in 2019, and the courtroom was filled with former members, reporters, and curious observers who had followed the case for years. The prosecution presented emails, recordings, and testimony, showing how Raniere created a structure of fear and control. Witnesses described how his philosophy of empowerment was used to justify loyalty at any cost. Jurors saw how collateral was collected to keep people silent. The defense argued that all participation was voluntary, but the evidence of coercion and manipulation was overwhelming. After a 6-week trial, the verdict was unanimous. Keith Raniere was convicted on all counts, including racketeering, wire fraud, and sex trafficking. In October 2020, he was sentenced to 120 years in federal prison, effectively ensuring he would never be released. The public reaction was intense. HBO produced the documentary The Vow, giving audiences an inside look at how NXIVM operated and how followers were drawn in. Other documentaries and podcasts analyzed the group, highlighting the psychological tools Raniere used to keep control. Former members began to rebuild their lives, some speaking openly about how difficult it was to leave. For many viewers, it was a shocking reminder of how even intelligent, accomplished people can be pulled into systems of manipulation when the promises sound just right. Imagine signing up for a seminar, thinking it might help you with business or relationships, only to find yourself months later in a world where every decision is monitored, where trust is replaced with fear, and where the leader claims to know what is best for you. That was the reality for many who joined NXIVM. Today, Keith Raniere sits in federal prison. He continues to insist on his innocence, and a small number of followers still support him. But outside those walls, his reputation is sealed. He is not remembered as a teacher or a thinker. He is remembered as a man who built an empire of control and lost it all when the truth came out. The story of Keith Raniere is not only about one man, but about the danger of unchecked influence. A leader who promised freedom ended up taking it away from others. And in the end, the courts made clear that even those who call themselves visionaries must answer for what they do when the doors close. Number 3. Dwight York. It began in New York City in the 1970s, where a man named Dwight York first introduced himself as a spiritual teacher. Charismatic, sharp-dressed, and persuasive, he claimed to hold special wisdom that could lead people to a higher truth. His words drew in followers searching for meaning in a turbulent era. Over time, those teachings shifted and grew into something more elaborate. York eventually built an empire known as the Nuwaubian Nation, a movement that combined Black nationalism, Egyptian imagery, and elements of UFO belief. On the surface, it looked like a religious community with temples, schools, and music. Behind the curtain, it became the center of one of the largest cult scandals in American history. York's background was full of reinvention. He changed names, altered teachings, and rebranded his group multiple times, from the Ansaru Allah community to the Nuwaubians. Each new version promised enlightenment and a chance to belong. By the 1990s, York and his followers had moved from Brooklyn to a sprawling compound in Eatonton, Georgia. There, they built pyramids, statues, and a village they called Tamare, designed to look like an ancient Egyptian city. For residents of rural Georgia, it was a startling sight. Golden sphinxes rising above the pines, followers in robes, and parades celebrating their leader. To his followers, York was a prophet. He delivered long lectures, wrote books, and insisted he had connections to otherworldly beings. Children were taught in his schools, families worked on his land, and the movement was tightly closed to outsiders. But as the compound grew, so did scrutiny. Local officials worried about zoning violations. Neighbors complained about secrecy and intimidation. And beneath it all, whispers of deeper misconduct began to emerge. By the late 1990s, law enforcement had started to take a closer look. The FBI, IRS, and local police began investigating reports of financial crimes and possible abuse within the compound. Former members came forward with accounts of strict control and disturbing practices. For years, it was difficult to penetrate the tight circle York had created around himself. But in 2002, federal agents finally moved in. After a long investigation, Dwight York was arrested and charged with multiple counts of racketeering and abuse. The scale of the case shocked even seasoned investigators. York, who had once presented himself as a teacher and healer, was accused of manipulating and exploiting those who trusted him most. The indictment described a pattern of financial fraud, coercion, and exploitation carried out over decades. During the trial, prosecutors showed how York used his spiritual authority to control every aspect of life inside Tamare, leaving followers dependent on his approval. The courtroom was packed. Reporters from CNN, the Associated Press, and local Georgia outlets filled the seats. The once mysterious compound became headline news. The defense argued that York was the victim of religious persecution, that his community was misunderstood because of its unusual beliefs and appearance. But the evidence presented by prosecutors, documents, testimony, and financial records, painted a picture of systematic abuse of power. In 2004, the jury delivered its verdict. Dwight York was convicted on multiple counts of racketeering and exploitation. The sentence was severe, 135 years in federal prison. The compound in Georgia was eventually demolished, its pyramids and statues taken down, erasing the physical symbol of York's empire. The public reaction was swift. Many Americans had never heard of the Nuwaubians before the trial, but suddenly, images of their compound appeared on every major network. Former members spoke out about how the community had pulled them in with promises of purpose, only to trap them in fear. Law enforcement praised the case as one of the most significant cult prosecutions in the country. Imagine driving down a quiet Georgia road and seeing Egyptian pyramids rising out of the forest. To outsiders, it seemed almost theatrical, like a theme park dropped in the wrong place. But for the people inside, it was deadly serious. Every day, they were told that York was their only path to salvation. That is the power of belief when placed in the wrong hands. Today, Dwight York sits in federal prison, serving a sentence that ensures he will never walk free again. His movement has splintered, with some former followers still defending him, but the compound that once stood as his temple has vanished. What remains is a cautionary tale, a man who promised enlightenment, but instead built a system of control and deception. The story of Dwight York shows how dangerous charisma can be when combined with isolation and unchecked authority. He began as a preacher of peace and ended as a prisoner of the state. And for the families who once called him their guide, the lesson came too late. Number 4. Adnan Oktar. In Istanbul, Turkey, television viewers once tuned in to a show unlike anything else on the air. The set was lavish, filled with chandeliers, gold furniture, and young women in heavy makeup who danced beside their host. That host was Adnan Oktar. To some, he was a religious teacher offering sermons and commentary. To others, he was a celebrity with an eccentric style. His followers called him Hoka, meaning teacher. But behind the bright lights and smiling dancers, prosecutors later revealed something far darker. By the time his case reached a courtroom, Oktar would be facing one of the longest prison sentences in modern history. Adnan Oktar was born in Ankara, Turkey in 1956. He studied philosophy and art history before emerging as a public religious figure in the 1980s. At first, his message was simple, a blend of Islamic teaching and fierce opposition to Darwin's theory of evolution. He gained attention with his books and pamphlets, especially a glossy text known as the Atlas of Creation, which he mailed worldwide. But as his fame grew, so did his organization. He began gathering a circle of loyal followers in Istanbul. By the 2000s, that circle had grown into a powerful cult-like community, with Oktar at its center. The public saw a strange mix of religion and entertainment. On his TV channel, Oktar sat surrounded by young women he called his kittens, delivering sermons and commentary while they nodded and smiled. The shows looked glamorous, almost surreal, and they aired daily. Supporters claimed it was a modern way to spread faith. Critics called it a front for manipulation and exploitation. Behind the stage, investigators later said, Oktar ran his group with total control. Members were isolated from families, pressured into loyalty, and monitored closely. According to prosecutors, young women were recruited into his inner circle, where they were expected to show devotion not just spiritually, but personally. Dissent was not tolerated. Allegations of intimidation, blackmail, and financial schemes began to pile up. For years, rumors swirled in Turkish media, but Oktar seemed untouchable. He had wealth, fame, and influence, and he used all of it to protect himself. That changed in 2018. In a dramatic operation, Turkish police raided Oktar's lavish compound in Istanbul. Television crews captured the scene, armored vehicles, lines of officers, and dozens of his followers taken into custody. Oktar himself was arrested and charged with a long list of crimes, including organized criminal activity, fraud, espionage, and exploitation. The charges described an empire built not on faith, but on control and fear. The trial became a media sensation. For years, Turkish newspapers and international outlets like the BBC, CNN, and Al Jazeera covered every detail. The prosecution brought testimony from former members who described the pressure they faced inside Oktar's movement. Financial experts traced how money flowed through his network. Authorities accused him of running his group like a criminal syndicate disguised as a religious community. Oktar denied everything. In court, he claimed he was the victim of a political conspiracy. He said his teachings were peaceful and that his followers were loyal because of love, not coercion. But the evidence presented painted a different picture. Witness after witness described how difficult it was to leave his group, how fear and intimidation kept people silent, and how the organization had extended its reach into politics and business. In 2021, the court delivered its verdict. Adnan Oktar was convicted on multiple charges, including fraud, espionage, and sexual crimes. The sentence stunned observers, more than 1,000 years in prison. On appeal, the court increased it to a staggering 8,658 years. Though symbolic, the number was meant to reflect the gravity of his crimes and ensure he would never leave prison alive. The reaction in Turkey was explosive. Some saw it as overdue justice for a man who had manipulated religion for personal gain. Others, especially his remaining followers, claimed it was unfair persecution. Internationally, the case made headlines for its sheer scale. The images of Oktar on his glittering TV set, surrounded by his kittens, were replayed against footage of him being led into court in handcuffs. For many, the contrast was jarring, from celebrity preacher to convicted criminal facing a sentence longer than any lifetime. Imagine switching on the television and seeing that stage. The gold furniture, the music, the women in designer dresses, and a man in a suit speaking with calm certainty. To viewers, it may have looked like entertainment. To his followers, it was faith. But to investigators, it was evidence of something sinister hiding in plain sight. Today, Adnan Oktar is serving his sentence in a Turkish prison. His TV channel has been shut down, his properties seized, and his organization dismantled. Yet some loyal supporters still believe he is innocent, holding on to the image of the teacher they once admired. The story of Adnan Oktar is a warning about how power can be hidden behind glamour. He used television to create an image of modern faith, but behind the cameras was a network built on control. In the end, the bright lights faded, and what remained was a prison cell and a sentence longer than history itself. Number 5. Abdullah el-Faisal. In the early 1990s, a preacher with a booming voice began drawing attention in London. His name was Abdullah el-Faisal. Born Trevor William Forrest in Jamaica, he had converted to Islam as a teenager and later studied in Saudi Arabia, where he embraced a hardline interpretation of the faith. By the time he arrived in the United Kingdom, he had reinvented himself as a fiery imam. He delivered long sermons in small mosques and community halls, and eventually on cassette tapes that spread far beyond his immediate audience. His message was controversial, and in time, it would land him in prison. El-Faisal was charismatic. He quoted scripture with confidence, told his listeners he had unique insight, and drew in young men searching for identity and purpose. But mixed in with talk of faith were calls to violence. British authorities grew concerned as recordings of his speeches circulated. They contained language that praised terrorist attacks and encouraged followers to fight against Western governments. At a time when global tensions were already high, his words set off alarms. By 2003, the United Kingdom moved against him. Prosecutors brought charges under laws against inciting racial hatred and soliciting murder. In court, jurors heard tapes where he encouraged the killing of non-Muslims and promised rewards in the afterlife for those who acted. The defense argued he was being targeted for his beliefs, but the evidence left little room for doubt. That year, Abdullah el-Faisal was convicted and sentenced to 9 years in prison. He served about 4 before being deported back to Jamaica. His release did not quiet his influence. Back in Jamaica, el-Faisal resumed preaching, this time using the internet to reach an even wider audience. Online sermons and chat forums gave him direct access to young people across continents. His name began to appear in connection with individuals who later attempted or carried out attacks. Intelligence agencies across the US and Europe kept him on their radar. For many counterterrorism officials, he symbolized how dangerous words could be when broadcast without limits. In 2017, el-Faisal was caught in an undercover sting. An FBI informant posed as someone interested in joining extremist groups. According to court documents, el-Faisal provided contacts and advice on how to travel to areas controlled by militants. That evidence was enough to bring new charges. He was extradited to the United States, where he faced trial in New York. The proceedings drew heavy media coverage. Reporters from the New York Times, BBC, and CNN followed every development. Prosecutors presented messages and recordings showing that, even after his first prison term, el-Faisal continued to encourage violence. The defense argued that he was only offering religious guidance, not actual instructions to commit crimes. But jurors once again saw a clear line between his words and dangerous action. In January 2023, the verdict was delivered. Abdullah el-Faisal was convicted of supporting terrorism and sentenced to 18 years in prison. The judge noted that his influence had reached far beyond his immediate circle, and that his role as a preacher made his words especially harmful. For el-Faisal, it was the second time his voice had carried him from the pulpit to a prison cell. The public reaction was strong. To many, el-Faisal represented the global challenge of radicalization. He was not a fighter himself. He did not plant bombs or carry weapons. Yet his speeches inspired others who did. Authorities highlighted the case as proof that dangerous rhetoric, left unchecked, could travel across borders and cost lives. Former followers who testified said they once believed him completely, only to realize later that his promises of glory were empty. Imagine sitting in a crowded hall in London, hearing a preacher speak with absolute conviction, telling you that you are chosen, that your struggle is holy, and that action will bring honor. For a young person searching for meaning, those words could feel powerful. But when the message is twisted, what feels like guidance can lead to destruction. Today, Abdullah el-Faisal sits in a New York prison. His recordings have been removed from many online platforms, his followers scattered, his influence diminished. But his story remains a warning of how a single voice, amplified through modern technology, can reach across oceans and shape events far from its source. The life of Abdullah el-Faisal is not remembered for the faith he claimed to teach, but for the harm his words caused. A man who once promised enlightenment instead spread division and hate. And in the end, the same voice that drew people in also delivered him to justice. Number 6. Goel Ratzon. In the crowded streets of Tel Aviv, Israel, police once uncovered a home that looked ordinary from the outside. Behind its doors, however, they found a world controlled by a single man. His name was Goel Ratzon. To neighbors, he was quiet and mysterious. To his followers, he was a prophet with mystical powers. For years, he lived surrounded by dozens of women and children who treated his word as law. But when investigators looked closer, they discovered a system built not on miracles, but on manipulation. In the end, Ratzon would be sentenced to decades in prison, his empire dismantled, and his promises exposed. Goel Ratzon was born in Israel in the 1950s. He lived an unremarkable life for many years, but in the 1990s, he began presenting himself as a spiritual figure with healing powers. He claimed he could bless the sick, offer guidance, and connect followers to divine energy. Slowly, women began to gather around him, convinced he had a special gift. They moved into his home, bringing their children and belongings. Over time, that household expanded into something unlike anything authorities had ever seen. By the early 2000s, Ratzon's home was filled with nearly 24 women and more than 30 children, all of them devoted to him. They dressed modestly, spoke about him with reverence, and even carried tattoos of his name. Some called him their savior. To the outside world, it was bewildering. How could one man command such loyalty? To those inside, the answer was simple. They believed he held the key to their future. But devotion came at a cost. Former members later explained that Ratzon ruled with total authority. He dictated what women could wear, when they could leave the house, and even who they could speak to. He set strict rules about money, food, and relationships. He convinced them that disobedience would bring curses or misfortune. Over the years, those rules became more suffocating, and slowly, whispers began to reach the authorities. In 2010, Israeli police launched an investigation. At first, they suspected fraud, since Ratzon lived comfortably while his followers often had little. But as detectives interviewed former members, the picture grew darker. Witnesses described a pattern of psychological manipulation, where fear and superstition kept women under his control. They explained how Ratzon used his authority to take advantage of his followers, convincing them he alone could determine their fate. The arrest was dramatic. In January 2010, police raided his Tel Aviv home and removed dozens of women and children. News cameras captured the images, frightened faces, children clinging to their mothers, and Ratzon himself led away in handcuffs. The case dominated Israeli headlines. Newspapers described him as a cult leader. Television broadcasts replayed footage of his followers, some still insisting he was innocent. For the public, it was both shocking and difficult to understand. The trial revealed just how deep his control had gone. Prosecutors presented testimony from women who explained how they had been isolated from family and taught to obey Ratzon without question. They showed the rules he had written, hundreds of detailed regulations dictating how the women should behave. The defense argued that the relationships were consensual, that the women stayed because they wanted to. But jurors saw the imbalance of power and the way fear had been used to enforce loyalty. In 2014, the court delivered its judgment. Goel Ratzon was convicted of multiple counts, including exploitation and sexual assault. The sentence was 30 years in prison. For many in Israel, it felt like the end of a mystery that had haunted the country for years. The women and children were freed from his control, left to rebuild their lives outside his shadow. The public reaction was intense. Israelis debated how one man had managed to control so many people in the middle of a modern city. Documentaries and news specials tried to explain the psychology of cults, how belief can override reason when someone is desperate for meaning. Former members spoke about the long process of healing, how difficult it was to step back into normal life after years under Ratzon's rules. Imagine being one of those neighbors in Tel Aviv, seeing women file in and out of that apartment, hearing whispers about a man who claimed to be a prophet. For years, it might have seemed strange but harmless. Only later would the truth come out, that behind those walls, lives were being controlled in ways no one should endure. Today, Goel Ratzon remains in prison. His home has long since been emptied, and his movement has collapsed. The tattoos of his name remain on some of his former followers as painful reminders of the years they spent under his influence. For Israel, his case stands as one of the most notorious cult scandals in the nation's history. The story of Goel Ratzon shows how power can grow quietly, hidden in plain sight. He convinced dozens of people that he was more than a man, that their futures depended on him. But in the end, no illusion could withstand the truth revealed in court. What once looked like faith was revealed as control, and what once seemed like prophecy ended with a prison sentence measured in decades. Number 7. Tony Alamo. In the 1960s, a man named Tony Alamo began preaching on the streets of Hollywood. Born Bernie Lazar Hoffman, he had reinvented himself with a new name, a slick style, and a booming voice that promised salvation. Alongside his wife Susan, he founded the Alamo Christian Foundation. At first, the group drew in young people from the counterculture movement, promising a new life of faith and community. But what began as a ministry soon turned into one of the most notorious religious cults in America. Alamo was a master of image. He wore flashy suits, spoke with confidence, and claimed he could heal the sick. His sermons blended fire and brimstone warnings with promises of miracles. By the 1970s, he and Susan had built a following that stretched across California and Arkansas. Followers lived in communal homes, worked in foundation businesses, and gave their earnings to the ministry. Alamo used radio and television broadcasts to spread his message, and his face became familiar to thousands. To outsiders, it looked like a booming ministry. Inside, it was a world of strict rules, unquestioned authority, and growing abuse. When Susan died in 1982, Tony claimed she would rise from the dead. He kept her body on display for months, telling his followers to pray for her resurrection. It never came, but by then, his grip on the group was absolute. He controlled marriages, finances, and even the day-to-day lives of members. Those who resisted were shunned. Critics described his ministry as a cult, while Alamo insisted he was a prophet chosen by God. Through the 1980s and 1990s, trouble followed him. He was investigated repeatedly for financial crimes and labor violations. The Internal Revenue Service pursued him for tax evasion, pointing to millions of dollars that flowed through his church businesses. In 1994, he was convicted of federal tax crimes and sentenced to 6 years in prison. Even then, his organization did not collapse. He continued to preach from behind bars, and his followers remained loyal. When Alamo was released, he returned to Arkansas and tried to rebuild his empire. But darker allegations were already circling. Former members came forward describing years of strict control and mistreatment inside the foundation. Law enforcement began investigating claims that underage girls had been groomed and married off within the group. By the mid-2000s, prosecutors had enough evidence to take the case to court. In 2008, FBI agents raided Alamo's compound in Fuke, Arkansas. Dozens of children were taken into protective custody. The images of buses pulling away, filled with young faces, ran on national news broadcasts. Alamo was arrested and charged with multiple counts of transporting minors across state lines for illegal purposes. His trial in 2009 was one of the most closely watched in Arkansas history. Prosecutors presented testimony from former members who described how Alamo used his position as a religious leader to demand loyalty and obedience. They explained how fear and punishment were used to enforce silence, and how his teachings were twisted to justify his actions. The defense insisted the government was targeting him because of his faith, a claim he had used for years whenever under investigation. But this time, the jury was not persuaded. The verdict was guilty on all counts. The sentence was extraordinary: 175 years in federal prison. The judge called Alamo's conduct heinous and ensured he would never walk free again. The once flamboyant preacher who had promised eternal life would spend the rest of his days behind bars. The fallout was immense. Properties linked to the Alamo Foundation were seized and sold. Survivors of the group began to speak openly about their experiences, some for the first time. Documentaries and news specials aired, examining how Alamo had managed to build such a loyal following for so long. For many Americans, the story of Tony Alamo became another example of how religious authority could be twisted for personal gain. Imagine hearing a preacher on late-night radio, his voice full of conviction, promising that your pain could end, that your sins could be forgiven, that your life could have meaning. To someone searching for hope, that message could feel irresistible. But when the promise is used to build power instead of truth, the cost is devastating. Tony Alamo died in 2017 while serving his sentence in a federal prison in North Carolina. His followers dwindled, his empire crumbled, and his name, once broadcast across the nation, became a warning of what happens when trust is betrayed. The story of Tony Alamo is remembered not for the gospel he claimed to preach, but for the lives damaged under his control. A man who promised salvation left behind only pain, and a leader who once filled airwaves with his voice ended his life in silence behind prison walls. Number 8. Larry Ray. It began on a college campus in New York. Sarah Lawrence College, a quiet liberal arts school just north of the city, was known for creative students and progressive ideas. In 2010, a group of undergraduates moved into a dorm called Slonim Woods 9. Among them was a young woman whose father had just been released from prison. His name was Lawrence Ray. He told them to call him Larry. What started as a temporary visit turned into one of the strangest and most disturbing stories ever to unfold on an American campus. Larry Ray was a man with a complicated past. Born in Brooklyn in the 1950s, he spent years in business, politics, and the military. He cultivated connections with high-ranking officials and even claimed ties to law enforcement. But behind the scenes, he had also faced fraud charges, accusations of manipulation, and multiple lawsuits. By the time he showed up at Sarah Lawrence, he was looking for a fresh start. To the students he met, he presented himself as a wise mentor who had survived government conspiracies. He claimed he could help them with stress, family conflicts, even personal growth. At first, the students welcomed him. Here was an older figure who cooked them meals, listened to their problems, and offered advice. He slept on the couch, told stories late into the night, and gradually inserted himself into their lives. Within weeks, he convinced them that his experiences made him uniquely qualified to guide them. What seemed like kindness slowly shifted into control. Ray used a mixture of charm and pressure. He told the students their families didn't understand them, that only he could reveal the truth about their lives. He convinced them they had hidden trauma and claimed he could help them heal. Soon, they were attending long sessions where he grilled them about their pasts, breaking down their confidence. He introduced ideas of debt and repayment, telling them they owed him for the time and wisdom he was providing. Over months, those debts grew into thousands of dollars. By the mid-2000s, Ray had moved several of the students into his Manhattan apartment. Neighbors saw groups of young people coming and going at all hours. Inside, prosecutors later said, he demanded loyalty, controlled their schedules, and manipulated them into handing over money. Some students gave up savings, others drained their parents' accounts. According to testimony, Ray pressured them into physical labor, coerced confessions, and convinced them that any failure in their lives was proof they owed him more. What began as friendship had turned into a system of exploitation. For years, the story remained hidden. Then, in 2019, New York Magazine published a bombshell article titled "The Stolen Kids of Sarah Lawrence." The article laid out how Larry Ray had infiltrated the lives of students, isolating them and taking their money. The piece went viral. Other outlets picked it up, and federal investigators opened a full criminal case. In February 2020, Larry Ray was arrested. Federal agents described him as the leader of a cult-like group that used coercion, threats, and psychological manipulation to control his victims. The charges included extortion, sex trafficking, forced labor, and money laundering. The indictment painted him as a man who had turned a college dorm into the starting point of a criminal enterprise. The trial in 2022 was headline news. Former students testified about how Ray had convinced them to sever ties with families, perform unpaid work, and hand over large sums of money. Prosecutors showed financial records, recordings, and witness statements. The defense argued that the students were adults who made choices on their own. But jurors saw the pattern of manipulation clearly. In April 2022, Larry Ray was convicted on all counts. In January 2023, the sentence was handed down, 60 years in federal prison. The judge said Ray had inflicted unspeakable cruelty on people who trusted him, and that his conduct was among the worst the court had ever seen. The public reaction was immediate. Documentaries and podcasts unpacked the case, with Hulu releasing Stolen Youth: Inside the Cult at Sarah Lawrence. Viewers were stunned that a man could walk into a respected college, set up in a dorm, and within months build enough influence to control the lives of educated young people. The story became a modern example of how manipulation doesn't always happen in remote compounds or isolated deserts. Sometimes it happens in the middle of a campus, hiding in plain sight. Imagine being a parent, sending your child to college with hope for their future, only to discover years later that a stranger had convinced them to give up money, independence, and even their identity. That shock was shared by families of the students who testified against Ray. Today, Larry Ray sits in a federal prison, serving a sentence that ensures he will never leave. The dorm at Sarah Lawrence has returned to normal campus life, but its name remains tied to his case. For many, the story stands as a reminder that control can take many forms, and that even smart, capable people can be pulled into destructive systems when trust is misused. Larry Ray once promised he could heal. Instead, he left behind broken lives, empty bank accounts, and a legacy of betrayal. Number 9. Wayne Bent. In the high desert of New Mexico, far from major cities, a small group of people built a compound they called Strong City. They believed the world was on the verge of ending, and they looked to one man for guidance. His name was Wayne Bent, though he often went by the name Michael Trevesser. To his followers, he was a prophet chosen by God. To outsiders, he became the center of a case that drew national attention, exposed on television, and ended with him serving time in prison. Wayne Bent's story began like many others in American religious history. Born in 1941, he grew up in a traditional setting, but eventually became involved in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Over time, he grew dissatisfied with mainstream teachings and began claiming he had received direct revelations from God. By the 1980s and 1990s, Bent had gathered a small group of loyal followers who believed he was a messenger for the end times. He declared that the apocalypse was near and that only his guidance could prepare them for it. The group eventually settled on land in Union County, New Mexico. There, they built homes, gardens, and a chapel. They called it Strong City, a place where they could wait together for the final judgment. From the outside, the community looked unusual but peaceful, a handful of families living in isolation, guided by a leader with intense beliefs. Inside, however, prosecutors later said, the rules were rigid and Bent's authority was absolute. Bent preached long sermons about purity, prophecy, and preparation for the end. He told followers that God spoke through him directly and that his commands were sacred. Families gave up jobs and homes to join him in the desert. Children were raised within the compound, with little outside contact. Over the years, allegations of troubling behavior began to surface. Some former members claimed Bent blurred boundaries between spiritual and personal relationships, especially when it came to young women in the community. By 2007, state investigators and child welfare authorities began looking closely at Strong City. That year, National Geographic released a documentary called Inside a Cult, which featured interviews with Bent and his followers. The footage shocked viewers. Bent calmly described himself as the embodiment of divine will, and his followers spoke with complete devotion. But hidden in their testimony were troubling details that raised alarms for law enforcement. In 2008, New Mexico authorities arrested Bent. He was charged with criminal sexual contact with a minor and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Prosecutors argued that he had manipulated his role as a spiritual leader to cross lines that should never have been crossed. The trial began later that year, and reporters from CNN, AP, and local outlets filled the courtroom. In court, Bent defended himself by saying his actions were symbolic, acts of spiritual healing rather than abuse. He denied exploiting his followers and claimed he was the target of persecution for his beliefs. His defense team argued that the state was criminalizing religious practice. But the jury saw it differently. They listened to testimony from young women who had lived inside Strong City and considered the broader pattern of Bent's control. In December 2008, Wayne Bent was convicted of criminal sexual contact with a minor and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison, with 8 years suspended. The conviction sent shockwaves through the small community of Strong City. For the followers who still believed in him, it was a devastating blow. For critics and former members, it was long overdue justice. The reaction in the wider public was one of disbelief. Many Americans had only learned about Bent through the documentary, where he appeared as a calm, almost grandfatherly figure, speaking about the end of the world. To then see him led away in handcuffs reinforced the idea that appearances can be deceiving. Reporters revisited the compound, speaking with members who still called him their prophet. Some refused to accept the verdict, insisting he was innocent and wrongly targeted. Imagine being one of those jurors sitting in the courtroom while a man in his 60s calmly explains that he is God's chosen, that what he did was holy, while prosecutors lay out evidence that told another story. The weight of that decision rested not just on law, but on conscience. Wayne Bent served several years before being released in 2016 due to health issues. By then, his following had largely splintered. Strong City still exists, but only a fraction of the members remain. The once tightly controlled community has faded into obscurity, remembered mainly through documentaries and court transcripts. The story of Wayne Bent is remembered as one of control and collapse. He promised salvation in the desert, but left behind broken families, criminal convictions, and a tarnished legacy. He called himself a prophet. The courts called him a criminal, and history records him as another leader who used faith not to lift people up, but to bring them under his control. Number 10. Shoko Asahara. On a spring morning in Tokyo in 1995, Commuters crowded onto the subway. It was supposed to be an ordinary rush hour. Instead, it became the scene of one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in Japan's history. The group responsible was called Aum Shinrikyo, and at the center of it all was a man named Shoko Asahara. To his followers, he was a guru with divine powers. To the world, he became the face of a nightmare that shocked an entire nation. Shoko Asahara was born Chizuo Matsumoto in 1955. He grew up in a poor family in Japan's Kumamoto Prefecture and attended a school for the blind due to partial blindness himself. As a young man, he studied acupuncture and traditional medicine, eventually opening a small business. But he also developed a fascination with mysticism, religion, and apocalyptic ideas. By the 1980s, he began gathering followers who believed his claims of supernatural visions and healing powers. He changed his name to Shoko Asahara and declared himself a messiah. In 1984, he officially founded Aum Shinrikyo, meaning Supreme Truth. The group mixed elements of Buddhism, Hinduism, and doomsday prophecy. Asahara preached that the world was heading toward destruction and that only he and his followers would survive. He built a headquarters outside Tokyo, attracting thousands of members, including scientists and professionals. They donated money, cut ties with their families, and pledged loyalty to him. From the outside, Aum Shinrikyo looked unusual, but not immediately threatening. Members wore matching outfits, practiced meditation, and produced books and videos of Asahara's teachings. But inside, the movement grew darker. Prosecutors later revealed that Asahara demanded obedience, controlled marriages, and began stockpiling weapons. He recruited chemists to create dangerous substances, convinced the world would soon end in war. For his followers, this was not just a religious group. It was preparation for survival after Armageddon. By the early 1990s, authorities were already suspicious. Aum was linked to kidnappings, poisonings, and the deaths of critics. Families of members begged police to intervene, but for years the cult managed to avoid major legal action. That changed on March 20th, 1995. On that day, 5 Aum members boarded subway trains during Tokyo's morning rush. Each carried a small bag filled with liquid sarin, a powerful nerve agent. At designated stops, they punctured the bags with umbrellas, releasing the gas into crowded cars. Chaos followed. Commuters collapsed as the toxic fumes spread. Train workers rushed to remove the leaking bags, some dying as they tried to protect passengers. By the end of the day, 13 people were dead, and more than 6,000 were injured. The images of rescue workers in hazmat suits, subway cars filled with gas, and victims carried out on stretchers were broadcast worldwide. Japan, a nation known for safety and order, was shaken to its core. Investigators quickly traced the attack back to Aum Shinrikyo. Police raided the group's compound and discovered stockpiles of chemicals, weapons, and documents detailing apocalyptic plans. Shoko Asahara was arrested within weeks, hiding in a small chamber inside the cult's headquarters. The arrest was televised, and images of him being carried out by masked officers became iconic. The trial that followed was one of the longest and most closely watched in Japanese history. It stretched over 8 years, with prosecutors presenting testimony from former followers, survivors, and experts. They described how Asahara's teachings mixed fear with promises of salvation, convincing highly educated people to surrender everything. Evidence showed that he had ordered not just the subway attack, but also earlier murders and attempts to test chemical weapons. Asahara's defense claimed he was not directly involved, that rogue followers acted without his knowledge. But the court rejected that argument. In 2004, Shoko Asahara was convicted and sentenced to death. He spent years on death row as appeals were exhausted. Finally, in July 2018, he and several senior Aum members were executed by hanging. The public reaction to his execution was mixed relief and reflection. Survivors of the attack spoke about their continued health struggles, while families of victims said justice had finally been served. Japanese society looked back on how such a group could have grown so powerful in plain sight. Documentaries and books examined the psychology of Aum Shinrikyo, how fear of the apocalypse and promises of enlightenment led thousands to surrender to one man. Imagine being on that subway, on your way to work, expecting a normal morning, and within minutes finding yourself gasping for breath, surrounded by strangers collapsing to the floor. That moment scarred not only the victims, but an entire nation's sense of safety. Today, the name Shoko Asahara is remembered not as a prophet, but as one of the most notorious cult leaders of the modern age. His movement splintered, with some followers trying to distance themselves from his crimes, but the shadow of Aum Shinrikyo remains. For Japan, his story is a permanent reminder of how dangerous blind devotion can be when it is placed in the hands of a man who preaches fear. Shoko Asahara promised supreme truth. What he delivered was tragedy. And his legacy ended not in glory, but in a prison cell, and the final silence of a death sentence carried out by the state. We've come to the end of the video. Which of these cases stood out to you the most? Do you believe justice was truly served? Let me know your thoughts, and where you're tuning in from, in the comments below. If you found this video interesting, give it a like and tap the bell so you never miss a new upload. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and see you in the next one.